261. Cursed Black Stone. The camp was quiet. When Eno felt Fide's sudden surge of joy, he decided to investigate. He didn't know which sort of ghost this would turn out to be. If it was a physical, animate undead like the ones in the darker tales, something that could actively fight, it would be invaluable for research. If it was only the harmless, wailing green ghosts of children's storybooks, then it would be useless. Under the silent night sky, a blue streak of light flashed, and Eno slipped out of the tent. Far to the east, in the White Mountains, a figure in a black hooded cloak moved toward the Moria Creek camp. The Lord of Rivendell, Elrond, arrived quietly as well. As one of the few high elves left in Middle-earth, Elrond did not need to hide, even to cross into Mordor. Wearing Vilya, the Ring of Air, he could go almost anywhere. The three elven rings, Narya, the Ring of Fire, Nenya, the Ring of Water, and Vilya, were potent, each with its own domain: passion and fire, preservation and clarity, and wisdom and swiftness of air. With Vilya, Elrond's reach was immense. But by the end of the Third Age, elven power had waned. There were many things he no longer could ignore, and many he could not intervene in directly. Tonight, he had chosen to come under cover of darkness. In Rivendell's main tent, he found Theoden and quietly told him of another of Sauron's forces, a pirate fleet. Meanwhile, in Erech Valley, Eno walked a narrow mountain path that barely allowed a single traveler. Fida sat on his shoulder, radiating excitement. The smell of curses and pain hung in the air. The shadow under Eno's feet writhed. The boggart at his side raised a curtain of black mist instinctively. It did not actively reach out, so the mist was limited, but even that small veil created a terrifying sight. Through the hush of the path, a more ghostly darkness loomed, a form wrapped in the mist, hazy and indistinct. Yet the mist skirted around Fide as if reverent. Perhaps if anyone looked straight at the veil, the first thing their eyes would catch were Fide's bright ones. Time crept on. Following the path, Eno arrived at the cursed place and finally saw the legendary Door of the Dead. The aura of life seemed to call something forth. Countless green figures streamed out, spilling like water until the whole place thrummed with death. But Eno's face fell. These were the undead from the books, cursed spirits, not the kind of solid, battle-ready revenants he'd hoped for. They were surrounded by death and sorrow, but they were basically like Hogwarts ghosts, incorporeal and aimless. He wasn't entirely surprised. If there had truly been a whole army of immortal dead under some master's control, Aragorn would hardly have promised their release so easily. It made more sense for him to attack Mordor first and set them free after. Disappointed, Eno still didn't leave. Both the boggart and Fide seemed to relish the place. The undead gave way before them, as if making a path. The Eddin who dwelt here, the hill folk Gandalf liked to tease, lived in ramshackle holes and tunnels, a tangle of tunnels and burrows that looked as if they had been gouged out by generations of hardship. "State your purpose," came a hoarse voice. Oaks, the last monarch among the Edain, had noticed the stranger long before, but the aura around him and the blue bird on his shoulder had given Oaks pause. He had meant not to provoke trouble, but now the man had come straight through the Door of the Dead and seemed content to stroll on. Oaks could not pretend not to see it. Eno turned. A crowned figure stepped from a ring of the undead. "Purpose?" he asked, nonchalant. "My purpose is no purpose," Eno said. "I came because I'm curious. I'll leave soon. You don't need to trouble yourselves." Oaks burned with humiliation at the dismissal. His hand tightened on his sword, but his gaze kept flicking to the blue bird. He was undead. What he wanted most was release, not destruction. Slowly, his grip slackened. "Then look," Oaks said at last, his voice losing some of its hardness and gaining instead a note of grief and helplessness. "But when you're done, leave." Back in the Rohan camp later that night, Eno confronted Fide in the tent. "Tell me exactly what you did to them," he demanded. He was not blind. Those spirits on the path had been cursed for 3,000 years and were no small matter. They were incorporeal, but they did not feel like the silly ghosts from a children's tale. Fide's ecstatic outburst had happened before, once after drinking the despair potion siphoned from Lord Voldemort, and this time's joy suggested something similarly dangerous had occurred. Fide turned his head, reluctant, then after a beat of thinking he coughed and spat a small black stone onto Eno's palm. It looked as if it had been pried free from somewhere. Eno's mind raced. Before he could act, the boggart's curtain snapped down over the stone. It flowed like black liquid and dissolved away. Fide flapped and pecked desperately at the shadow, but the boggart shrugged off the attacks. The tent erupted in a fuss, but Eno was already watching the boggart's veil with a second, sharper eye. Within the curtain of darkness, the shapes were not random. They took the posture of armed soldiers. Their gear and ornamentation matched the look of the undead they'd seen at the door of the dead, though less nimble. Worse, there were many of them. A rough count suggested hundreds, perhaps 1,000. Isildur's black stone, Eno muttered, the pieces falling into place. He looked back at Fide, who turned away innocently and used his brilliant blue tail to shield his beak. "You're a phoenix, not a thief," Eno said, half to himself and half to the bird. He sighed. Things had gone this far. He would have to do more to make amends. If taking something had been that easy, he thought, he wouldn't have given up the Christmas presents from Narnia back then. The first ray of morning sun slid down over the camp at the fords of Isen. The whole place was alive with noise, but it was a noisy of horses, neighing, stamping, low snorts, while the riders of Rohan moved in measured silence, fastening chainmail and checking lances. Far to the south, the white city of Minas Tirith steamed with smoke and fire. The once brilliant capital of Gondor was crowded with the horrors of war. Endless orcs from Mordor, towering trolls, ironclad siege engines and catapults, and high above them all the Angmar Witch King, chief of the Nazgul, astride a fell beast. Yet Gondor's defenders fought on stubbornly. The city's tiered defenses meant that even if a gate fell, the soldiers could fall back and hold the next wall. In the outer court, on the third level, Gandalf stood with sword in one hand and staff in the other, cutting down orcs as they surged up the steps. He saw nothing but slaughter, Gondor's exhausted men and the feral masses of the enemy, but still they held, bodies and steel forming a human bulwark. Then, at the edge of the sky, came the first sign of Rohan. A single cavalryman appeared, a speck that grew into a thunder of hoofbeats. Dust rose in a rolling wall as 5,000 riders burst into view, banners snapping in the wind. King Theoden took in the situation with a single glance and drew his sword. It was the signal. The Rohirrim lowered their long spears, angling them forward from horseback to strike at throats rather than helmets. Under a sheet of dark, enchanted cloud, Minas Tirith looked ruined and noble. Facing orc armies many times their number, the riders of Rohan betrayed no fear. A solemn, fierce loyalty to an old oath passed through them like a pulse. At that moment, Eno drew his wand. "Sunlight reappears," he cried. A warm, sacred beam flared from the tip of the wand. On a broomstick, wand held aloft, Eno plunged toward the orc army. From their vantage on the walls, Gondor's defenders saw what looked like a flicker of dawn, a fragile thing against the storm, but it streaked ahead boldly toward the clouded sky above the enemy. Rohan's horns blasted, and the 5,000 surged forward. The charge became a living blade, a wave of horse and rider aimed straight at the orc positions. Something in the sky shifted. The black clouds Sauron had poured over the land split as if a hand had ripped them apart, and a true shaft of sunlight fell on Eno's wand. The pale pre-dawn became a sun blazing over the battlefield. Orcs, unlike Saruman's Uruk-hai, were naturally cowed by sunlight. To them, it was poison to their spirits. A small sun seeming to rise above them made their makeshift defenses buckle and scatter. Seeing how the light bent the day, Eno adjusted his plan. He had intended to fly straight for the Witch King, but with every eye turned upward, he could do more for the charge below than to seek a single kill. He hovered above the orc lines and guided the sunlight with his wand, opening a corridor for the Rohirrim to pour through. Magic could be used, and he knew the limits. Interfering too deeply while the forces of men took the field would be like blaring death metal at a concert of sacred hymns. The age of men needed men to seize it. Still, he would help where he could. After all, Fida had been greedy and eaten someone else's things, and a little extra effort seemed fair. "Expecto Patronum," he shouted. Within the sunlight, a bright stream of silver coalesced and then took form. A great blue whale, 20 feet long, swimming through the air as if the sky were an ocean. A Patronus. In Middle-earth after Helm's Deep, such things were strange and awe-inspiring. Fish and birds have freedom of up and down that land animals lack. an odd, Eastern symbolism of liberty that made a whale's Patronus feel right. The whale arced behind the orc lines, its presence a shield of light that rendered the enemy archers in the rear unable to loose their arrows. Without that rain of arrows, the charge of the Rohirrim became all the deadlier. When the first spears slammed into the orc ranks, the result was swift. In an age of cold steel, cavalry could do terrible damage to infantry. A few breaches often meant the rest followed, and soon the orc formations were broken and slaughtered as horsemen cut through them. Eno felt the sunlight shift, as if it no longer belonged to his wand alone, but poured down onto the riders of Rohan and upon the battered white city itself. He did not notice that the blue whale Patronus under that light began to glow with another faint radiance. Above the roiling battle, Eno saw a lone, dark figure approaching on the wind. He raised his wand. Sectum Sempra, the half-blood prince's signature curse, a cutting charm born of spite, streaked toward the Witch King. Its target, Eno meant, was not the Witch King himself, but the fell beast under him. Against a flying opponent, the cut of the air was at least as useful as an attempt to wound the rider. The Witch King, master of terror and shadow, could not see the curse in the way men saw spellcraft, but the scent of it, an old, bitter magic, told him to react. He swung his long sword instinctively. The spell's tearing blade met the Witch King's steel and hissed as it was deflected. The attack had been tense, but not decisive. Eno did not despair. He had not expected one spell to end the contest. He drove his voice and wand harder. Avada. The killing curse flashed green from his wand. He could not rain down extravagant magic. The ground beneath him was crowded with Rohan cavalry, and any broad, destructive magic might kill friend and foe alike. He fired the green light as precisely as he could. The Witch King did not meet that one with a sword-driven parry. Sensing a different, deadlier intention, he guided his fell beast with a cunning, inhuman motion and dodged. The two of them, Wizard on Broom and the Lord of the Nazgul, fell into a strange deadlock. Eno firing and feinting, the Witch King slashing and the beast twisting away. On the ground, Gandalf had seen the duel from the first. He watched the green and silver flashes in the sky, and seeing that neither side could gain the upper hand, chose his moment. The gray-clad Maiar looked at the sword in his hand, Foehammer, and without a moment's hesitation, hurled it upward. The blade flew toward the sky, spinning, a white comet arcing in the dawn. It headed straight for the place where Eno rode his broom. Sorry, everyone. Originally, I planned to finish Middle-earth today. As you can see, it might have to wait until tomorrow. Sorry. Minas Tirith. Gandalf had thrown his long sword aside and no longer watched the battle in the sky. With his 2-meter staff, he moved in wide, powerful arcs, and his skill still forced the orcs to fall back again and again. Above the city, Eno cast two Sectum Sempra spells in quick succession, urging his flying broom backward. There was something coming straight at him. He had a shield charm up, but why take the risk when he could avoid it? The object, however, seemed to correct its course as if it had a tracking mind of its own. A longsword floated alongside the broom, a meter-long blade, rich and elegant, its surface etched with runes that caught the starlight. Glamdring, forged by the High Elves in the Second Age, had come back to him. For a moment, memory rewound to 100 years ago, to a small morning courtyard at Bjorn's house. This time, unlike before, Eno took the hilt. Wand in his left hand and sword in his right, he wasted no time. Shielded, he charged the Witch King of Angmar. Seeing his opponent drop from magic into close combat, the Witch King relaxed and let the Morgul blade in his hand flare with a wicked light. "You overestimate yourself," he hissed. "No one can kill me." The leader of the 9 Nazgul spoke at last. Eno said nothing. The provocation aimed to lure him into swordplay, and that was precisely his choice. The Witch King's ring-wrought power might have made him resistant to ordinary steel, but he had forgotten that some weapons answered darkness itself. As the old tale told, a certain blade could strike him down. With Glamdring gripped in both hands, the duel shifted from long-range sorcery to brutal close quarters. On the ground, the fight had already swung decisively. The Rohirrim's charge had torn into the remaining orcs. Under their lances, the enemy broke like a herd. Inside the siege of Minas Tirith, the human defenders, though outnumbered, fought with fierce discipline and high spirits, clearing the city systematically. Victory seemed near, until the horn sounded from the southwest. This horn was not the bold call of Rohan, but had an eerie, rolling tone. The earth shivered. Across the field, the Rohirrim stared in disbelief as the Haradrim's war Oliphants lumbered into view. More than 20 titans, each over 100 meters high, their 6 tusks bound with blades. They moved like a living mountain range. Terror rode with their weight, not just the sheer scale, but their brutal indifference. Wherever they passed, friend or foe alike were crushed, pierced by blade tusks or trampled into bloody mash. Theoden blew the gathering horn. The riders regrouped on the Pelennor. Of the original 5,000, only a little over 3,000 remained, thanks to their chainmail and grim fortune. Even so, Theoden knew the odds. It would be a miracle if many survived the Oliphant's advance. Rohan courage left no choice. Charge they must. Rohan, outflank and withdraw, Theoden ordered. Retreat with the cavalry. I will deal with those Oliphants. At that moment, Fai appeared on the field, clutching an old briefcase. When it hit the ground, the clasps came undone, and one by one, thousands of acromantulas spilled forth. 4-meter tall, spear-bearing spiders might frighten men, but beside the 100-meter Oliphants, they looked negligible. They did not hesitate. The spiders ran low and fast toward the giants. Fai watched, eyes on the spears, a bitter familiarity in his expression. He understood why he had been brought to tears. The spiders were engineered for this, prepared for Oliphants, and for the possibility that even a hero might be pinned. It was not orcs, but the Haradrim and their elephants that had threatened the Rohirrim. High-angle volleys, 6 blade tusks, and limbs that crushed cavalrymen. To meet such force required a force equal and opposite. Acromantulas, armed with spears dipped in Faid's tears. The spiders' 5-fold magical defense let them ignore the Haradrim's arrows. Some were trampled or skewered by tusks, but many slipped beneath the Oliphants' bellies. Poisoned spears found tender spots. With a thunderous bellow, a 100-meter behemoth crashed down, shaking the earth and raising a choking cloud of dust. The first fall triggered others. The giants toppled like dominoes. What had seemed an irresistible wall vanished almost as quickly as it had appeared. At the same time, pirate ships drifted down the Anduin. Aragorn arrived with 30 rangers of the Dunedain and 1,000 elite soldiers from Gondor's southern fiefs. Behind them stormed the eerie mountain people's ghosts, greenish, wavering host, pouring into the field like tide and turning the momentum completely. Above, the witchery of the sky reached its climax. Fidi suddenly appeared hovering beside the Witch King, no more than 2 feet tall, his wings a frantic blur. He darted and pecked at the fell beast as if a tiny pest had found its mark. The Nazgul's mount, sensing some natural enemy, began to falter. Deprived of its usual agility, the Witch King was vulnerable. Eno seized the moment. Glamdring flashed and found purchase in the immortal flesh. The high elven blade did more than wound. It broke the Witch King's malignant will and severed the invisible bonds of his power. The unseen sinews that tied his spells together were cut, and the fate of the Angmar Witch King was sealed. 264. The Serene Shire and the Brass Key. The Shire lay peaceful. In a lush apple orchard, Eno sat alone beneath a tree, using a fine sword to carve a piece of white ivory. The ivories had come as a courteous gift from the Haradrim, and the longsword in his hand was another trophy, the Morgul blade taken from the Witch King of Angmar. The foe hammer he had returned to Gandalf after the battle. He had refused it 100 years ago, and he refused it now. Half a year had passed since the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, and more than 4 months since the One Ring was destroyed. After a brief rest, Gondor and Rohan had mustered once more and launched a desperate attack toward Mordor, an assault that drew Sauron's attention and bought the rest of the world its fate. Frodo had done what was needed and cast the ring into the fires of Mount Doom. The great tale of the Second and Third Ages had come to a close. Eno declined Theoden's invitation and returned to the Shire, to the home and friends he had left behind. The hill where he had once grown pipeweed had been cleared by the White Witch and replaced with a green orchard. After a day's work among the trees, he pushed open the familiar round door of Bag End. "Why tire yourself so? When I'm not here, you should call Frodo to help," Bilbo scolded, but there was a tremor in his voice that belied the reprimand. Eno caught Bilbo's hand mid-reach and gently stopped him from going into the kitchen. "You're not too old to move," Bilbo insisted defiantly, but his tone softened with a sorrow that came from long memory. "Poor Frodo. I don't know what he's been through. Everything will be all right. Trust me." Eno patted Bilbo's shoulder. He had seen Frodo's wound. The Morgul blade had pierced him, and though the ring was gone, the blade's curse had already spread beneath the skin. No healer's hands he knew, no spell, and not even the Dittany of Crete could draw out such an evil. If Fide had been a normal phoenix, perhaps things would have been simpler, but life offers few such ifs. For now, Frodo endured the pain and waited for the journey to the Undying Lands in the west. After soothing his old friend, Eno set the kitchen to rights with a few quiet spells. He had stayed at Bag End these past 6 months. Bilbo's years made the hobbit's care necessary. Half an hour later, a succession of dishes, simple, hearty, homely, floated to the table. As they ate, Eno looked across at Bilbo and said softly, "Old friend, let me tell you a story." "That's good," Bilbo replied, breaking off to smile. "I remember when we first met, you said you were a bard. At the time, I was far more interested in the food than in words." He laughed, then fell quiet as fragments of memory surfaced. "I suppose I never properly told a story of my own." Eno smiled and, with a small sweep, a suitcase in the bedroom flew open. A stack of neatly bound parchments and a self-writing quill rose into the air. "This story begins in the Shire, the homeland of hobbits," he said, and began to play a gentle tune on his zither. Time ran like fine sand through fingers. A week slipped by in a haze of watering the orchard, walking with Lena, and sitting in Bag End telling tales. Frodo joined them on the second day, and the three of them listened as Eno recounted the long, humble path of the uncle and his nephew. From the arrival of dwarves at the hill, through the journey's dangers, to the final destruction of the ring. He did not dwell on only the grand, momentous scenes. He lingered on the small, human things. The wood elf Doris, Julia the old woman from Gondor, young Lily, brave but tactically blunt Hyojed, and the 5,000 of Rohan's elderly, infirm women and children they had helped. Each was a story, and each a hero in their own right. A bard measures worth by story, not by length. "And so the Fellowship finished its task," Eno said, the last notes fading. "The ring was destroyed, and Frodo and Sam returned to this beautiful, fertile land." A stillness fell over Bag End. Eno felt that same stirring to depart again. It was as if the world waited for his last word. He folded the parchments and, with a gentle smile, pushed the stack toward Frodo. "You're writing your own tale," he said. "Take these. Middle-earth stories should stay in Middle-earth." Frodo took them with a quiet, grateful look. Eno stood, his gaze drifting around the round room. He knew that when he left again, this place would be different, diminished by departure. Bilbo watched him sharply. "Are you leaving again?" the old hobbit asked. "Yes. The stories here are done. I must go elsewhere to tell them." They embraced, and Bilbo nodded. "It's good to leave," he said. "The Shire may not be your final destination, but it will always be your home." Bilbo shuffled off toward his room and returned carrying an old brass key, worn by years of handling. "I meant to give this to you when we parted," he said with a chuckle, "but you always were quicker to leave than me." He set the key on the table. "This is the key to Bag End. Frodo and I will go west, but Bag End must have an heir. Let it be yours until you return." Eno accepted the key without hesitation. "When the Fourth Age begins, once I have recorded enough stories, I will come find you." "Then I will wait for you in Valinor," Bilbo declared, and something like youth lit his eyes for the first time in many years. He was well over 100, his body showing the long years of the ring's strange gift, yet in that moment his face held the bright, eager look of adventure once more. 265. 10 Years of Dreams, Draco's Arrival. The Middle-earth story had ended. In Shelter Valley, Eno opened his suitcase and methodically sorted its contents, setting aside the things he wouldn't need right away. The journey felt like stepping into another world. 10 full years had passed. In the tale, he'd aged from a 15-year-old boy to a 25-year-old man, and even now, after the reversal, it all felt like a grand dream. 10 years had blurred a lot. As he looked around, the earnest ice troll, the thriving garden in the valley, the 3 healthy magic trees, Memories that had once been fuzzy snapped back into focus, as if loading a saved game. It even has an anchor effect, he murmured with a chuckle. Then he vanished. The troll resumed its work, pulling a harrow across the soil, while a group of goblins that followed didn't sow seeds as they normally would. 5 of them dragged a linen-wrapped bag and scattered small stones from it into the furrows. Trolls and goblins weren't the brightest of creatures to begin with, and after their transformations, it was easy to mistake tiny stones for seeds. Hogsmeade. A summer afternoon that was at once a little melancholy and comfortably pleasant. It had been 3 days since Eno returned to the wizarding world, and he hadn't left his cottage once in that time. Those 3 days had been enough to reacquaint him with the rhythm of magical life, waking, reading, cooking, and in the afternoons slipping down into the sanctuary valley to lie on the flower-strewn ground and enjoy peaceful solitude. When he came up again today, Eno found himself watching the horizon. Dark clouds and humid air were rolling in from the southwest. England, it seemed, was determined to be indecisive about its weather. It had been clear this morning. Now it looked like rain. With a distant rumble, a summer downpour began. Rain beat against the windows in a soft, steady patter that somehow made the moment more tranquil. Upstairs in the cottage, Eno leaned back on the bed, eyes closed, letting the rain lull him into a rare, deep calm. "This is life," he sighed, and soon the room filled with the even rhythm of sleep. He woke to a persistent tapping. Knock, knock, knock! An owl with sodden feathers pecked at the window. He opened it with a flick of his wand, and the little bird came in, dripping. "Draco?" he said, recognizing the messenger at once. Hogwarts had only been on summer break a few days. What could be so urgent that Draco would send an owl in the rain? "Scourgify," he muttered, brushing the rain from the owl's feathers, then opened the letter and read. A few minutes later, he trudged downstairs, a smile and an exasperated look mixed together. In the sitting room, the fireplace flared green as the flue connected to Malfoy Manor. Draco stepped through, dragging a trunk behind him. "Running away from home?" Eno teased from the sofa. "I suppose I am." Draco sank onto the opposite couch, shoulders hunched. "My letter was vague," he added when Eno raised an eyebrow. When Eno pressed for the story, Draco finally let it spill out, his voice tight with annoyance and embarrassment. He'd been forced into a string of society banquets over the holiday, prodded to make advantageous acquaintances. Lucius and Narcissa, with Voldemort's threat not looming now as it had in the original timeline, had turned their attention to the Malfoys' other obsession, marriage and social alliances. 15-year-old Draco had been made to schmooze pure-blood heiresses and endure endless introductions. "I don't understand," Draco said in bewilderment. "When did marriage become a business partnership?" "Refuse them," Eno said bluntly. "If they won't listen, tell Uncle Lucius it was my suggestion." He was siding with Draco. Marriage should be about feeling, not political maneuvering. If Lucius wanted influence or magical advantage, there were more modern, less archaic ways to do it. They could learn from Dumbledore, or even consider a blood pact if they were truly after binding alliances. In any case, parents forcing their child into suit after suit was ridiculous. Draco's expression softened. He knew, as few did, how much Eno's opinions mattered to his family. Hearing outright support lit something in him. "Eno, thank you," he said earnestly. Eno waved the thanks away. "It's nothing. You ran away over this?" He smiled. "Stay here for a few days, then go home. And when it comes to choosing, follow your feelings. It doesn't matter if she's half-blood or a Hufflepuff, so long as you like her." He left the last phrase deliberately casual, but Draco understood the meaning behind it well enough. Draco relaxed a little more, a small, genuine smile appearing for the first time since he stepped through the flue. On the table nearby, a small leaflet had been left from one of Eno's earlier readings. He glanced at it idly and then set it aside for later. Shoudy's share today, Snallygaster, origin and distribution. The Snallygaster, a dragon-like magical creature, is found in the United States. Physical characteristics: resembles a dragon. Abilities and uses: the heartstring of a Snallygaster was once used as a wand core by James Stewart and Iseult Sayre, founders of Ilvermorny School of Magic. Related knowledge: in Muggle folklore, the Snallygaster is a dragon-like cryptid said to inhabit the mountains around Washington, D.C. and Frederick County, Maryland. 266. Fox's Visit. Life always found ways to surprise him, full of sudden turns. When Mr. and Mrs. Lucius learned where their son was, they didn't scold him for running away. Instead, they sent a house elf to live there permanently. After confirming the elf wasn't Dobby, Eno let him stay. Having someone to take care of 3 meals a day made life even lazier. On the second-floor study, a 3-foot-long sword lay across the large desk, the Blade of Morgul. As the Witch King of Angmar's weapon, it was in many ways no weaker than the famed Sword of Striking. Under the oil lamp's glow, the intricate runes along the blade stood out. This was a different method from magical alchemy. The dense inscriptions looked less like a conventional spell and more like an array of proverb-like enchantments. The discovery fascinated Eno. Such an unfamiliar alchemical system likely hid many intriguing insights. What frustrated him was that he lacked the key to unlock it. These weren't ancient runes. They were unique scripts from Middle-earth, words that carried power. Trying to decipher them without a reference was like attempting a 1,000-piece jigsaw without the picture on the box. After 2 days with no progress, he set the runes aside and turned back to developing the film mirror. His strength had genuinely increased. 10 years wandering Middle-earth, the passive growth of his magic, his spiritual experiences, and practiced use of spells. Though he had never met Lord Voldemort, Eno no longer thought himself far behind. This wasn't arrogance, but a calm certainty, the kind that comes from having weathered many trials. He also had Feed and the Boggart at his back. The Boggart, especially, had changed since absorbing fragments of the cursed black stone from Mount Erech. It might no longer be right to call it a Boggart. Nightmare suited it better. Where once it had been a thin black mist, now calling it up produced a curtain of darkness that surged like a tide and spread over 100 acres of the valley. 100 acres wasn't small. It was nearly 60 football fields, and that was just the immediate curtain. If its power were expanded into the old fear smoke form, the reach would be far greater. Eno hadn't dared to try that. After absorbing those black stone fragments, the nature of the thing had changed. The curse placed in the black stone by Isildur, the High King of Gondor and Arnor, the man who raised Narsil and cut the ring from Sauron, meant that undead from Mount Erech were now woven into the curtain when the Boggart took on the stone. Unlike the mere atmospheric dread of Aragorn's company in the stories, the black undead inside the curtain could genuinely attack, provided their victims were trapped within it. To test them, Eno performed experiments in the valley. A 10-foot diameter boulder, struck by arrows, spears, or sword slashes summoned by the undead, would be marred to an inch deep. Don't underestimate an inch on hard rock. That was comparable to the effect of a large-caliber rifle shot. After a decade in Middle-earth, Eno had real confidence. In a confined environment, he wouldn't need to show himself. Unleashing that curtain alone could wear an opponent like Voldemort down to death. But life rarely offers such neat ifs. Powerful wizards were rarely immobile. Back in the study, after a brief pause to collect his thoughts, Eno returned to transcribing runes. Time slipped by unnoticed until the bronze oil lamp's flames suddenly wavered. He glanced up automatically, then relaxed. Fawkes was already perched on the desk, cocking his head and watching the lamp with curious eyes. The flicker had been a greeting, apparently between friends. "Long time no see, Fawkes," Eno murmured. Fawkes answered with an almost human nod and a letter tied to his leg. There was only one sender who would use a phoenix for mail so extravagantly, the old headmaster himself. A few minutes later, Eno opened a drawer, pulled out a clean sheet of parchment, and wrote his reply. The letter arranged a time to meet. Dumbledore had mentioned before the summer break that, now the film mirror was in the headmaster's office, he would introduce Eno to the legendary alchemist Nicholas Flamel. Eno was genuinely curious about Flamel, not for the legendary Philosopher's Stone, but for nearly 7 centuries of lived experience. People who wandered far had stories, and so did the long-lived. Talking with Flamel promised more honest history than any textbook, which tended to be polished and embellished. Lost in thought, Eno finished the letter and tied it to Fawkes's leg. Fawkes's feathers were warm and soft, and he gave off a friendly aura that made Eno want to hug him, but common sense won out. As Fawkes flew away, the oil lamp flickered a few more times. Eno smiled, Soon, he would have a proper phoenix of his own. It was late June. The 442nd Quidditch World Cup would be held in England in August, during the summer break. To be honest, if Newt and Old Flint weren't already working on preparations, Eno would have been reluctant to take part. The whole affair had started with the birth of a phoenix. By harnessing the emotions of over 10,000 people from Rohan, he had condensed the flame into the beginnings of life. If he did nothing, the phoenix would still be born eventually, perhaps just a bit later. 10 years in Middle-earth had altered his outlook. Compared to the role of a public figure, he yearned more for the life of Teacher Hans, a single person with a zither, wandering mountain villages and hamlets, quietly telling stories from afar. He wanted the simple pleasures of life. Fame and prestige were for those who chased them. Really capable people didn't put much stock in such things. Forget it, he told himself. Once this is over, I can finally get some good rest. He leaned to the window on the second floor and looked out. Hogsmeade in June had a particular beauty, the calmness of everyday life. After Fawkes left, the cottage welcomed new guests that evening. At the dining table, Draco prodded the owl in front of him. He'd never seen an owl so old and half dead. It's still alive, just ancient, Eno said. Instead of delivering letters, it should be enjoying its golden years in an owlery. I agree, Eno nodded. In terms of pathetic pet owls, only the Weasleys' Errol could give this one competition. After bringing water and food to the elderly bird, Eno noticed the letter the twins had sent. Draco, I might have to go visit the burrow tomorrow. Fred and George invited me. Weasleys, are you mad? Draco shot up instinctively, then sank back into his seat, recovering. Their family's all right. At least the twins aren't unbearable. Haha, exactly, Eno said, smiling. Want to come? Don't worry. If I'm there, you won't be an easy target. Draco thought it over. Old grudges didn't have to carry on forever. In the end, noble families, marriages, and old alliances made these things complicated anyway. Eno pushed the subject further. Come with me. We'll talk about the film mirror and try to get it into shops in Diagon Alley before the Quidditch World Cup. Draco paused, remembering how different life had been when he'd filmed those stories with the twins, far more fun than hanging around Crabbe and Goyle. Eno read him and made the decision for him. All right, you're coming with me tomorrow. Elsewhere, in a 3-story house in Manchester, Hermione had also opened a letter. It was from Snape. Tucked inside, along with the answers to her potion questions and dense, technical instructions, was a beautifully printed ticket. Quidditch World Cup, she breathed. Though she lived in a Muggle area, she kept up with the Prophet and knew how huge the cup was. The ticket was for a private box. The numbers on the back made her cover her mouth. Box A23. Ticket holder may invite up to 7 people. That made the value of the ticket stingingly clear, like a celebrity concert pass. Her next thought, half amused, was practical. But I'm not a Slytherin. She tucked the ticket into her potion textbook and studied Snape's notes instead, letting questions about the ticket slide for the moment. Late June settled over England like a hot blanket. Temperatures climbed toward 35 degrees, and people generally hid from the midday sun. The next morning, with the Malfoy house elves' help, Eno and Draco traveled to the burrow through the Flu network after breakfast. Eno had sent a letter to George and Fred the night before to explain the extra guest, politeness, and to prevent awkwardness. It's 8 o'clock, Eno said, hoisting a bag of packaged sweets as he stepped to the hearth. The burrow. Green flames rose and the powder fizzed. When Eno opened his eyes, he found himself in a comfortably chaotic room, Mrs. Weasley in the center, Fred and George grinning, shy Ginny and Ron face oddly blank. My dear, welcome, Mrs. Weasley said quickly, warm and a little flustered. I've wanted to invite you for a long time, but, well, you know our family's concerns about associating with Slytherins. I didn't want to cause you any trouble. She sounded apologetic, not insincere. She had wanted, at one time, to thank someone, ever since discovering Ginny's diary had been one of you-know-who's relics, but a letter from Bill had made them cautious. Gratitude was one thing. Getting someone else into trouble was another, especially a Slytherin still at school. Before they could say more, the fire in the hearth burst into green flame again. A slim figure with platinum hair stepped into the room. Welcome, my child. Mrs. Weasley had already smoothed into a more motherly tone. Don't be shy. Make yourself at home. The grown-ups' quarrels have nothing to do with you. Go on, play. I'll rustle up some pudding. She bustled off toward the kitchen, leaving the younger ones a little more at ease. Fred leaned in conspiratorially, eyes twinkling. Let's go upstairs. Some things aren't the sort of thing to talk about down here, and you never know who might be listening, he said. George chimed in, nodding toward Ron with a mock-serious face. Besides, we wouldn't want the Daily Prophet's special reporter overhearing. His storytelling's already better than Rita Skeeter's. Ron's cheeks went beet red. He glanced quickly toward the kitchen, seemed to see something, and then deflated like a popped balloon. Without a word, he wandered out into the yard. The twins grabbed Draco and pulled him upstairs, chattering breathlessly about this and that. Eno didn't go after them right away. Instead, he handed the bag of sweets to Ginny. He admired her a little, brave, straightforward, and practical, the sort of person who, when everyone else was asking why, would set about figuring out how. It was hard not to like someone like that. 268. 4 boys got together, and the Burrow clock. The Burrow sat in Devon, exactly the crooked, cramped house Ron had once joked about, the kind of place that could only keep growing upwards because no one in the Weasley line had thought to become an architect. From the outside, it looked grotesque and charming in equal measure. Inside, Eno found, the decor was just as interesting. The stairwell itself was a small museum of the way magic and Muggle technology had been thrown together and made to work. Rusty cauldrons were brimming with electrical plugs, old newsletters were plastered with Coca-Cola labels, and appliance manuals were tacked to the walls like certificates of honor. George and Fred's room was on the 4th floor, which fit the Weasley birth order. Bill, Charlie, and Percy down below, the twins up high. When Eno pushed the door open, he found George, Fred, and Draco riveted to a film mirror. The picture showed the familiar Tom and Jerry cartoons, but there was another voice running commentary on top. This stupid Tom, why doesn't he ever fight back? He's being played for a fool. Merlin, I've never seen anything so daft. Is that a troll? Oh, it is a troll. I really shouldn't have hoped for better. The cartoons were the same old antics, but the running commentary made everything funnier. Eno didn't interrupt them. He took a seat in a chair behind them and let his eyes roam over the room. George and Fred's room was suspiciously tidy and safe for 2 boys with their reputations. Knowing them, Eno didn't for a second believe they'd been well behaved. His eyes picked out a few giveaways: a raised floor under the bed, a bookshelf that appeared deep but was only shallow at the front, and a row of obviously fake landscape paintings. Finished watching? George called, mischief written all over his face. Eno rubbed his brow. We finished a while ago, but it looks like you found some secrets. You know too much, Fred grinned, showing a wicked look as he pretended to pull a wand from his sleeve. But the wand smelled faintly of licorice. Fred, realizing he'd been exposed, stopped pretending and bit into it. He was the only one who had been fooled. Draco looked at the twins with a sudden, small resentment on his face, as if he'd been the outsider of the joke. On the 4th floor, the boys talked and planned. Outside in the garden, Ron boredly chased gnomes, batting at them with a stick. To him, the ugly little creatures always looked like George and Fred in miniature. The Tom and Jerry cartoons had given all the younger Hogwarts pupils a way to spot differences between trolls and gnomes, but Ron, oddly, preferred the straightforward honesty of trolls. He'd decided early on that Tom never wanted to harm Jerry. Otherwise, Jerry would have been ripped apart by his sharp teeth long ago. I'm going easy on you, Ron muttered as he swung. The more gnomes he watched, the softer his expression became. He thought about Harry, who'd never seen gnomes before, and Colin, and all the other Muggle-born kids at Gryffindor who'd never even met one. An idea crept into his head. Catch a few of the garden gnomes, sneak them into the castle, and sell them. Even 3 nuts for a gnome would be decent pocket money. By the time he really considered it, Ron was looking at the critters with a tenderness that could have melted steel. Back inside, the conversation had turned practical. We need different models, Draco said, speaking from observation. 3 foot, 5 foot, 10 foot, and the bigger they are, the more luxurious they should look. People buy pride as much as product. It'd only be one use, though, George protested. Then don't make them one use, Fred answered firmly. Make cheaper, compact ones and link them to the big mirrors. We'll find a way around it. Fred's idea lit up George and Draco's faces, and Eno felt a little stunned. Where he'd been thinking of the film mirror's future as something like a smartphone, capable of recording, saving, and with two-way mirror alchemy circuits, two-way communication, Fred had come at it from a different angle. His plan was more like Muggle videotapes and televisions, use simple, existing technology and combine it with the mirrors. It was an idea Eno hadn't considered. The sort of thing that comes from being a little too close to the problem to see other routes. Time, as always, went too quickly when they talked. At noon, Mrs. Weasley urged them to stop and come down for lunch. Tomorrow, both of you, come to the cottage, Eno told the twins. We'll go to Croatia together, pick a site, and set up a proper production line as soon as we can. Don't worry, we'll be there, George and Fred said in perfect unison. What about me? Draco asked, feeling a little left out. Eno waved him off. Where else would you go if you don't come? Brione's got your share already. Draco's face brightened at the confirmation. On the first floor, the kitchen was the heart of the house. The room wasn't large, but it was warm and busy. At the center, a spotless wooden table was piled with dishes. Mr. Weasley and Percy, away on his internship, were absent, but 7 people still made for a lively lunch. After a morning of plans and jokes, Draco had relaxed around George and Fred. He no longer looked as guarded as when he had first arrived. Ginny sat quietly, shy and composed. Ron perched on his chair like a niffler who'd found a handful of galleons, terrified someone would try to steal his share. Eno's attention kept drifting to the Weasley clock on the mantelpiece. It wasn't a clock with numbers at all, but a single hand pointing to words. Tea time, feed the chickens, you're late, and so on. The whole thing was a kind of useful, homey piece of alchemy. Pet rota for today, Errol. Errol was the Weasleys' owl, a very elderly great gray, missing more feathers than he wore, forever bumping into windows and ceilings in clumsy flight. 269, Smart Ginny. After Molly had carefully finished cooking some of the familiar dishes, lunch officially began. Conversation was sparse, not only because the food was excellent, but because most of what needed to be said had already been said. When the meal ended and the boys trickled out one by one, only Ginny and Molly remained in the living room with Eno. After a moment's hesitation, Eno decided to ask to see the clock's secret. Molly, call me Aunt Molly. She cut in with a smile. All right, Aunt Molly. He complied without thinking. I'm really interested in alchemy, and this clock feels rather magical. Molly's face lit up. If you want to look, of course, and when Arthur gets back, I'll have him make you one of your own, though you probably won't need it for feeding chickens or pulling weeds. You mean Mr. Weasley made this? Eno sounded surprised. He had assumed it was an heirloom, not a modern piece. Molly nodded proudly. He likes to tinker. He says it's home improvement. There was a quiet pride in her smile, a warm satisfaction in her husband's knack for gadgets. Eno gave an approving look that acknowledged both the Weasleys' affection and Arthur's skill. Molly caught the double meaning, but soon turned to something more earnest. You're still young, she said, voice softening. When you look for someone to date in the future, don't only pay attention to looks. Those things aren't reliable. Eno listened to the kindly admonition with a patient smile, nodding from time to time. He understood her intent, a gentle, motherly warning given after learning a little about his past. After the short chat, Molly left. Given permission, Eno picked up an oil lamp and examined the clock. The alchemical circuit was unfamiliar, but he didn't try to fully understand it, only to copy it. Some things didn't need immediate comprehension, better to secure the design first. If he ever ended up in some fantasy world with lots of time, these unfamiliar bits would be good reading material. Time ticked by. The clock's circuitry was not terribly complicated. In about half an hour, he had duplicated it. Stretching, he turned and found Ginny watching him with a curious expression. Is there anything I can help you with? He asked. No, but I think there's something you should know. Ginny's face grew serious. All the formalities about the clock were done, so Eno sat and listened. As the heroine of the original story, Ginny had more than just plain looks. She was loyal, brave, quick-witted, and she trusted Harry implicitly. Seeing Eno settle down, she began. Hermione and I are very good friends. There are things I want to tell you, if you don't mind. Eno didn't interrupt. He nodded and listened closely as Ginny described Hermione's routine. She spoke of how hard Hermione works, harder than anyone, always saying she was tired only because she wanted to stay in the Transfiguration Club or to understand alchemical concepts. Ginny didn't speculate on motives or mention any names. She simply reported facts, times, places, what she saw Hermione doing. No guesswork, no dramatics, just precise observation. Hearing the list of small, tireless efforts made Eno a little emotional. The girl who used to be a know-it-all now worked in silence, pouring herself into study without fuss. The change in the story had reshaped people. After a moment, Eno decided to share something in return. He repeated what he had said the day before, about refuting the idea that Lucius controlled Draco's marriage, and added his hope that Hermione would never feel she had to change herself for anyone. Okay, Ginny answered earnestly. I'll find a chance to tell her. Relief showed on her face. Even though Hermione was a year older, Ginny had always worried that Hermione invested all her talent into study and came up short in simple emotional matters. That worry eased a little. By evening, with Mr. Weasley and Percy returned together, the burrow reached its peak population. 9 people filled the small house, and everyone loved the bustle. For the Weasleys, it was comforting. This family of 9 had always thrived on noise and crowd. For Eno, it brought back a distant memory of large family gatherings and New Year's Eves. Men clustered in one room, chatting loudly, the women bustling about preparing food, and the kids running wild. Arthur, George, Fred, and Draco crowded around the television, arguing and trading ideas. Arthur enthusiastically joining in. Hearing Fred's new notion made the head of the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts office even more animated. Clearly, Arthur knew a thing or two about videotapes and televisions. Meanwhile, Percy, intent on making his mark at the Ministry, sat next to Eno after dinner and chatted about current affairs. Eno didn't judge Percy's earnest ambition. Sometimes you need to be humble to get help, and bending for your ideals within reason is nothing to criticize. 270. Back to Brajuni Island. After the accidental damage some months before, Brajuni Island had been completely revitalized with generous funding. The dense scrub that had once choked the place had been cleared and replaced with tall trees, giving the Acromantula a lot more room to roam and making venom collection far easier. The former dragon preserve, after the last group of Ukrainian ironbellies was dealt with, no longer introduced new dragons for safety reasons. The island's business model had changed. They no longer bred dragons on site, but signed regular purchase agreements with nearby dragon preserves to supply fresh dragon meat. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement that made better use of resources and avoided unnecessary trouble. At the island's center stood a tasteful little manor. Eno sat at a table going over a financial report, while Daron, the middle-aged wizard in charge of the spider farm, sat opposite him. Well done, really, Eno said, setting the papers down. The spider farm was back on track and had generated a handsome profit, 3,000 galleons net in 6 months. Daron, humbled by the praise, deflected it. It's what I should do. If Mr. Scamander hadn't stepped in, things wouldn't be this peaceful. Daron was no longer the impulsive young man he'd once been. The island's recent upheavals had made him cautious and thoughtful. He knew the young boss in front of him had taken down 15 dragons and 23 adult wizards without a scratch, so humility suited him. Eno inwardly approved. Dependable, steady employees were rare and welcome. Daron, I need one more thing, Eno said. Build an alchemy workshop in the center of the island and hire a few Croatian wizards with an alchemy background. Recruiting locally had been a deliberate choice. It made more sense than flying people in from England. For long-term development, nurturing local talent was preferable. Half an hour later, as Daron left, Eno walked out of the office toward the other side of the manor. Compared to Eno's hectic schedule, Draco, as another shareholder in the spider farm, seemed relaxed. Under a leafy gazebo, 3 rattan loungers had been arranged. George and Fred lay back trading ideas while Draco chimed in occasionally. Candies and drinks were scattered nearby. They looked like tourists on holiday rather than businessmen. You all seem to be getting on well, Eno said with a smile as he stepped into the shade. From a distance, he'd seen them sprawled like they'd given up on work for the day. Finished with your tasks? What now? Draco sat up, the question obvious on his face. What next? Eno, we might stay here a few days, he answered, and an ice seat matching the rattan chairs rose from the ground. He sat and handed over 3 identical notebooks. These are detailed instructions for making a film mirror. Before we hire staff, I want you to learn the production process and then train qualified workers. None of the 3 reached for the notebooks at first. Clever people had a way of thinking alike. After a pause, Draco was the first to speak. Eno, thanks for trusting us, but isn't this a bit rash? Draco wasn't alone. George and Fred felt the same. They'd been in business their whole lives. They recognized the commercial value of the film mirror and were wary of the risks. Eno watched their faces and, seeing their concern, reassured them. Don't worry, this isn't reckless. The reason I'm doing this is that nobody would dare interfere with the film mirror. In business, hoarding all the profit is the worst motive. Eno wasn't worried, but the last dramatic incident at the Dragon Preserve had taught him to be cautious. Draco, do you remember the promise I made to them in the common room? He asked. Unlike the twins, Draco looked incredulous. You were serious? I thought you were just placating them. I don't placate with lies, Eno said. So I need your help. Notify the students up to 3rd year. I'll have Marcus handle the older ones. The location will be Malfoy Manor. Everyone will profit. What do you think? George and Fred finally understood. They exchanged a look that mixed surprise and something like awe. Eno's arrangement meant that everyone in Slytherin would benefit. For those raised in the wizarding world, the implications were clear. This was an agreement backed by power. If production techniques were revealed, few would dare to intervene rashly. Time passed quickly. Eno ended up staying on Brajuni Island for 5 full days. In that time, Daron had finished the workshop and recruited 3 Croatian wizards who had a rudimentary grasp of alchemy, enough, under the twins' guidance, to make a pair of straw rings. Daron had spread the word widely, but apparently only these 3 in all of Croatia knew enough about alchemy to be useful. Faced with picking the tallest among the short, Eno accepted the limitation with a wry shrug, and the private thought that perhaps Croatia simply wasn't very competitive. On the morning of the 6th day, with the island's initial construction complete, there was no longer any need to stay. Fided once again served as the transportation hub for the return trip to England. Eno opened a suitcase, and Draco and the twins climbed in one by one. Though he didn't believe Fide was dangerous, Eno had chosen to use a suitcase warded with an undetectable extension charm to avoid repeating the kind of tragedy Lucius had suffered. When there were no worries in his heart, even a gust of wind felt like freedom. Hogsmeade. The day after returning from Croatia, Eno slipped back into his old routine. He ate, read, watered the flowers, and in his free hours sat by the 2nd-floor window watching the sun sink in the west. It looked like a peaceful life, but after studying history of magic, he knew such calm was rarely stable. Great names never appeared by accident. Even in quiet times, some temperamental individuals rose up. Kind or cruel, they disturbed whatever peace existed. After finishing the day's watering, Eno didn't go back upstairs to watch the sunset. He stayed in the living room and waited. There was a long, unexpected knock at the door. For a moment, he froze, as if he'd forgotten the proper way to enter a house, knocking rather than barging in through the fireplace. He opened the door. In the warm glow of the setting sun stood a familiar, slender figure. Long time no see. It was Pansy, speaking just like at the banquet 3 years earlier. The light behind her picked out the smooth, dark bob that framed her face, giving her both youthful energy and an air of controlled capability. Long time no see. Come in. Eno stepped aside and she passed into the cottage. He couldn't help glancing at her back. The small girl he'd known before had changed a great deal. She moved into the living room and sat on the sofa, scanning the room with quick eyes. She didn't turn her head rudely, but she examined the furnishings as if cataloging them. The old house had been refreshed and now felt lived in and warm. Something about that made her unexpectedly sentimental. Eno returned from the kitchen with 2 glasses of honeyed lemonade. Noticing her expression, he teased, "I've tidied the place up nicely, haven't I?" Former owner of the cottage. The joke lightened the air, and for a moment they were back in that summer, her holding a stack of house deeds, him looking stunned. Pansy smiled, a confident arc of a mouth. "It's a nice place, but I wasn't the former owner," she said. After a brief pause, she added, "All the deeds I brought back then belonged to Mr. Parkinson, not me, at least not at the time." "It's all the same," Eno said, taking a sip. "Miss Parkinson will inherit it one day." "Perhaps," Pansy laughed, covering her mouth. The easy banter and shared memory drew them closer. After a moment, Eno set his glass down and asked casually, "Has anything happened to you lately?" At once, Pansy's expression grew serious. "Am I that obvious?" The question reminded him of his earlier self, of a conversation with Professor Flitwick in his second year. He decided there was no point hiding things. "Not outwardly," he said, "but I noticed another problem. Your magic is a little out of sync." Pansy frowned at that. "I noticed it the moment I walked in. Your magic seems beyond your years. We're only in our 4th year, but you give me the impression of facing a 7th year." Magic and maturation had always been mysterious. When everyone's power developed at roughly the same pace, the wizarding world stayed relatively stable. Sudden leaps in a young witch or wizard's power, though, usually followed some intense experience, a shift of mind or spirit. Magic was tied to the heart. George Weasley's inability to cast a Patronus after Fred's death was one clear example. When Eno pointed out her imbalance, Pansy's brows tightened for a moment, then smoothed with relief at his belief. "I don't know why it's happening," she said. "I'm not lying." "I know you're not," he said. "Magic problems are often beyond explanation." Her gaze was fierce and earnest. Eno turned slightly away, and the small movement registered with her. Disappointment flashed across her face. "Well, it's good you believe me. As for what caused it, I think it's tied to what I went through this semester." If someone else had asked, Daphne for instance, she might have answered guardedly. But looking into Pansy's clear eyes, she suddenly felt certain some people never needed guarding against. They sat together while she spoke. Eno listened, thoughts flickering through his mind. He felt partly responsible, he and Dumbledore both, in different ways. The mirror of Erised hadn't been well concealed. Someone had to find it, and a philosophy-minded Slytherin happened upon it. After more than 10 minutes, Pansy finished describing the semester. Eno asked, curious and a little wary, "So what did you see in the mirror? You know that mirror isn't straightforward." Pansy's first reply was soft. "It's false, yes, but it can show things that could be true." Then she said something that made him blink. "The wizarding world is sick," she declared, her voice steady. "The name of its sickness is capitalist exploitation." Her tone left no room for joking. She sounded as if this diagnosis were the conclusion of long thought. Eno felt a chill of recognition. Strong convictions could feed power. If her experience had crystallized into a firm belief, that belief could have driven her magic to grow faster than her years. Magic answered the will. Intense, youthful aspirations, Grindelwald, Dumbledore, Tom Riddle, had all built foundations in that way. The thought made him look at Pansy anew. The girl before him carried a different aura now, one that was quieter, more resolute, and strangely charged. That's absolutely impossible to achieve. Eno didn't bother to mince words. A utopia like that could not exist in the wizarding world. If it did, the world of magic would probably cease to be. He wasn't being alarmist. Magic sprang from ideals and wishes. If every wizard's ideals became one and the same, magic would lose its diversity. "Why is it impossible?" Pansy protested stubbornly. "Because of the nature of magic. What you're chasing is beautiful, but it's an illusion." He leaned forward this time, meeting her gaze instead of averting it. "Do you know what the greatest threat to wizards is? It's not dark wizards, not 5 times level magical beasts, not the International Statute of Wizarding Secrecy or muggles. The greatest threat to wizards will always be unchecked power." Though he spoke to Pansy, his mind ran through many things at once. He could, at least a little, understand Dumbledore, the way the old man clung to systems and rules even when he could ignore them. Perhaps Dumbledore had seen the likely end of certain paths early on and chose restraint. It wasn't prophecy, but an insight into human nature. Desires that expand without limit end in ruin. "I won't wield power without limits," Eno said. Pansy's disappointment showed. She had come hoping for a companion, for validation, and instead met doubt and caution. "I know your intentions are good," she said softly, "but can you live forever? Even Nicholas Flamel died once. What happens after you're gone? Won't you leave behind chaos and suffering?" Eno sighed. He had already decided he would pull Pansy back, even if it cost him a sleepless night. Some boxes, once opened, could not be closed. Outside the window, sunset faded into evening, and a pale crescent moon rose. "I'm not lying," he told her. "If you doubt me, I'll bring a pensieve. I'll show you the futures I've seen in divination." He spoke from the earliest matriarchies up through the events of Harry's first year, the fall of a great giant, and the changes that followed. Pansy replied, "I don't doubt you. I'm just hurt, a little disappointed." She slumped on the sofa, her earlier arrogance gone. The change in her felt deflating rather than victorious, and Eno felt no relief. Another worry had surfaced. The disharmony in Pansy's magic had worsened. 10 years in Middle-earth, countless experiences, and a growth in power had given him a useful trait many powerful wizards had, the ability to sense magical anomalies. He'd marveled at Professor Flitwick's use of it when he first entered the wizarding world. Now that same sense warned him that Pansy's magic was slipping toward chaos. It wasn't an uplifting resonance this time, but the first stirrings of disorder, like the spiritual collapse that can birth an obscurus. Downstairs, in his perception, her magic flared and chaotic emotions spread. It felt irreversible, but he refused to give up. He had to find a more grounded, realistic aim for her. At the same time, in the Ministry of Magic's third basement, the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes erupted with a shrill alarm. The Accidental Magic Reversal Squad, the department's frontline, snapped into action. Location, Hogsmeade. Highest alert, suspected obscurus. Move out. As the details were read over the consoles, the room grew heavy. Newer recruits didn't fully grasp the fear in the older staff's faces, but the veterans remembered what an obscurus meant. If things went wrong, it could consume lives as casually as eating a chocolate frog. "Merlin," said Josan, the squad's oldest member, "it's been 50 years since we had one in England, and of all places, Hogsmeade." He steadied himself and barked orders. "Remember your duties, but minimize casualties. If it gets bad, evacuate the wizards and pull back. This isn't like last year, when the Chosen One accidentally inflated his ant, so don't take unnecessary risks." The rookies sobered. Reading about an obscurus and facing one were worlds apart. Seconds stretched as the squad prepared to deploy. Then, as suddenly as it had sounded, the alarm died away. "Alarm lifted?" someone muttered. The flip from extreme alert to complete calm left everyone stunned, as if the crisis had been a phantom. Back in Hogsmeade, in the cottage's living room, Eno continued. "Even if you can't erase the statute or stop history, you can do something meaningful." He had thought of another, safer path, less utopian, but far more attainable. Pansy looked up, expectant despite herself. "Like what?" "For example, helping young wizards live more freely, working toward a world where everyone can stand in sunlight without fear, where wizards and muggles learn to coexist, where magic and technology are combined, small, concrete changes that make life better." He knew it sounded like fairy tale talk, an imperfect but reachable moon rather than the unreachable sun she'd sought. "Do you remember the train at the start of our second year?" he asked gently. "You, me, Draco, Daphne, we argued about the International Statute of Wizarding Secrecy. We talked about that girl who conjured flowers at her mother's grave." The memory surfaced like a charm, 4 young witches and wizards packed into a compartment, earnest and naive, debating things that felt distant then, but mattered deeply now. 273. "Girl, change your target. Are there foolish people in this world? Yes, but foolishness is not always the same as stupidity. When it concentrates on a single point, it can become a form of stubborn perseverance." After hearing another lofty ideal, Pansy's magic at last steadied. Wizards and muggles living in peace, living openly under the sun. She repeated the phrases to herself, weighing them seriously, and a new light kindled in her eyes, a small, captivating glow. To Eno, she seemed like a little luminous being. The chaos of magic around them calmed, folded into her, and settled. Though only a 4th year at Hogwarts, she now demonstrated magic that rivaled an adult witch's, and, most importantly, it was stable, without the earlier dissonance. "You helped me again," Pansy smiled. her brows curved in gratitude. Once she'd calmed, she realized how wrong-headed she'd been moments before, as if some extreme feeling had taken her over, as if the world had suddenly lost meaning and she had wanted nothing more than destruction. If circumstances or the person across from her had been different, she couldn't say what she might have done. The fact that she hadn't acted was probably due to the last lingering threads of attachment in her heart. Thankfully, that was over now. Eno felt complicated. Don't say that. Actually, some of it was probably my fault. The whole thing, it's my fault. In the original telling, Pansy wouldn't have been like this. She'd have gone on to a carefree life as a pure blood, finishing Hogwarts and living comfortably. My fault? Why would I blame the person who helped me open the window? Pansy replied, smiling, crossing her legs with the confident ease of a senior prefect. She wasn't old, but she carried the poise and charm of a seventh-year Slytherin prefect. When people are at leisure, osmanthus flowers fall. In the days after Pansy left, Eno slipped back into his usual rhythm. Leisure did not mean idleness. It was a relaxed attentiveness. Even in this easy mood, his gaze kept returning to a neat stack of letters on his desk. Among them were replies from Marcus and Draco, and letters from Old Flint, Newt, and even Fudge. Marcus's note confirmed the time of the banquet regarding the distribution of the film mirror. Most Slytherin students would attend, including some who had just graduated. Newt reported that preparations were going smoothly, so smoothly he hadn't had to push, and that the Ministry of Magic had given the project a green light. Old Flint's letter said much the same, with the caveat that they would need to visit the LAA headquarters before August. Arranging a stage for 100,000 wizards was not the same as organizing the Hogwarts House Cup. Lighting, instruments, and sound had to be on a different scale, and both the Department of International Magical Cooperation and the Department of Magical Games and Sports requested an original recorded soundtrack. Fudge's letter was the most characteristic. His bureaucratic English filled many pages, but boiled down to two things: the Quidditch concert and the Order of Merlin, 3rd class. Over 85% of the letter, whether directly or indirectly, argued Fudge's own indispensability, that without him as Minister of Magic, nothing would have proceeded so smoothly. There might be truth to it, but the florid rhetoric grated. Outside Hogsmeade, the dusk sky looked wrong. The western horizon hung under a heavy gray curtain that blotted out the sunset's usual glow. Crimson clouds that should have dyed the sky now fell under a bluish dusk as low, rain-laden clouds rolled in and brought a misty summer rain. Summer rain in England was often not a downpour but a scattered, persistent drizzle. The raindrops and the damp air together sounded like quiet, rustling sobs. Perhaps it was the country's particular melancholy. After listening to the rain for a while at his second-floor window, Eno padded toward his bed. Though it was only 7 o'clock, the sky was already nearly black. Living alone, one needn't keep strict rules. When tired, sleep. When hungry, eat. When bored, indulge a hobby. Miles away in Wiltshire, however, the evening was clear. A white manor nestled among lush trees, its stonework and fountains catching the last light of the day. At the head of the dining table, Lucius sat with Draco beside him, looking every bit the proud father. "Father, this banquet is confirmed. 67 guests," Draco announced, pride tinting his voice. "That's what Marcus and I arranged." Lucius' face softened at the sight of his son, who had grown almost to his height. "Draco, I'm very pleased you've learned to think, and learned not to blurt everything out," he said approvingly. Draco lowered his head modestly. Narcissa watched them, quietly pleased. The two before her were her whole life, and as a proper wife, she knew when to remain silent. After a moment, Lucius leaned back and sighed, then said, "Now speak up, whatever you were going to say." Draco straightened. "Eno invited some people who aren't Slytherin. There are Weasley and Longbottom from Gryffindor, Diggory and Abbott from Hufflepuff, and from Ravenclaw." "That's enough." Lucius cut him off before he could finish. He felt the need to teach his son another lesson. "Draco, tell me, what has allowed the Malfoy family to endure through the years?" "Endure?" Draco felt a flash of confusion. He'd always been taught about restoring the family's glory, not enduring. Lucius saw the change in his son's expression and felt no disappointment. The problem, he thought, lay in how they had raised him. Times had changed since you-know-who's fall, when everyone looked out for themselves. That era of survival required a particular education. Now, in a more peaceful age, their methods needed to change. If he didn't adapt Draco's upbringing, the heir of the Malfoy family might be thrown into confusion by a handful of guests from other houses. That kind of thinking was, in Lucius's view, both absurd and dangerous. Time passed quickly. Since July began, England had seen an influx of new faces, people of many different races and colors, all drawn by the same goal, the 442nd Quidditch World Cup. Arriving more than a month early might seem excessive to Muggles, but for wizards, it was ordinary. Without the same survival pressures, galleons mattered less. Even a poor wizard with a wand did not starve. For most, money was about improving life, not staying alive, unless someone was foolish to the point of catastrophe. July was a special month for other reasons besides heat. Magic loved the number 7, a boy born in July, Lord Voldemort's fall in July, the 7 Horcruxes. Fate seemed to favor the month, and so, on a weekend in early July 1994, Malfoy Manor threw a banquet that drew attention from across the European wizarding world. Wiltshire, a clear midsummer night. Stars freckled the northern sky. Ursa Major's Big Dipper, Polaris, Cassiopeia Cygnus, each one bright and steady. By 8 o'clock, Malfoy Manor buzzed with guests. Curiously, Lucius and Narcissa were absent. Most of the adults were missing too. The oldest people there looked 17 or 18, just out of Hogwarts. In the absence of his parents, Draco had taken charge of the house. In a crisp tuxedo and wearing a polite, warm smile, he moved among the guests with an easy authority that erased any sense of distance. Eno, by contrast, was more casual. He wore the familiar blue robe woven from spider silk and had gathered several non-Slytherin friends around him: George, Neville, Percy, Cedric, Hannah, Cho. Hogwarts divisions ran deep, and keeping these friendships required vigilance, so before the banquet began, Eno kept an eye on his friends from other houses. The feast was set on the lawn. As night fell and the lights came up, enchanted lanterns and magical illuminations made the manor dazzle. Fine china, fragrant bouquets, the soft perfume of blooming flowers, and the scent of rich food mingled with gentle music. The scene was breathtaking. At 8:30, Eno mounted the platform at the main table. His eyes swept the crowd. He didn't know everyone by name, but the faces were familiar. Faces he had seen in the common rooms, the great hall, corridors, and the library. "Good evening, everyone." His voice, aided by magic, carried clearly. "Seeing so many familiar faces, I feel like I'm hosting the start-of-term feast. Perhaps I'm just missing a sorting hat." A ripple of amused smiles. Then he adopted a more formal tone. "I'm very grateful you could all come, and I'm grateful for the era we're living in. This is a rapidly changing time, but some things won't change." He paused, letting the words settle as his gaze met those in front of him. "What's constant? Our care for one another, our pursuit of our dreams, and our hope for the future." The calm, steady cadence of his voice struck a chord. They were all young and full of plans. George and Fred with their joke shop dream, Neville with his gardens, Hannah dreaming of a dessert shop, Cedric glancing toward Cho. Eno cleared his throat. "I suppose everyone knows why we're here, but I want to make one point clear." He leaned in slightly. "I hope the film mirror becomes a tool for you to realize your dreams, not simply a way to amass wealth. That said, I welcome investment." For the next 15 minutes, Eno outlined the purpose of the evening, a gathering not unlike a Muggle-Harvard alumni network, but built around the film mirror. The idea was to create a diversified community of interests tied to the mirror. Those with capital, Draco, Pansy, Marcus, and the like, could invest directly. Those lacking funds, George, Fred, even Percy, could acquire shares by other means. Knowledgeable people could join research and development. Those good at social dealings could handle sales. Ministry employees could receive a slice through their positions. Beyond immediate profits, the point was to build an alliance that would be influential over the next 20 years. When groups produce influential people across fields, influence follows. The pureblood youth of the wizarding world had lacked that kind of institutional wisdom. Marcus, Percy, and former prefect Mina Burke had already seen the potential. Eno never explained the very beginning of the project. He hadn't even told Draco. From the start, his aim had been simple: to energize the wizarding world. The The grand spectacle also served a practical purpose, to clear paths for the film mirror's future. And, admittedly, it was partly because he preferred to watch a snowball roll rather than shove it the whole way. Once the interests began to compound, all it would need was careful guidance. After his speech, the banquet officially opened. Conversation flowed, plates were filled, and two people in particular were busy, Draco and Marcus. Each man sat at a table piled with stacks of parchment, applications, agreements, and prospectuses. People were already finding ways to join. Watching them work, Eno felt lucky. Without their help, the task of organizing this network single-handedly would have taken him decades. On the signing tables, small share prospectuses and creature dossiers were circulated, part invitation, part catalog. One sample read, Shaudi's share today, Glumbumble British Ministry of Magic classification level, XXX. Origin and distribution. Glumbumbles are native to Northern Europe. Appearance. A glumbumble is a small, gray, hairy flying insect. Habits. Glumbumbles nest in dark, hidden places, hollow tree trunks, caves. They feed on nettles. If they infest beehives, they disturb the bees and can cause catastrophic losses in honey production. Abilities and uses. Glumbumbles produce a treacle that induces melancholy. This treacle can also be used as an antidote to hysteria triggered by ingesting alihuot leaves. 275. Privet Drive. The moon hung high and the lights glittered. At Malfoy Manor, goblets clinked and everything felt relaxed and harmonious, yet there was an undercurrent of stiffness. The Slytherin students' ingrained hierarchy kept anyone from intruding carelessly. In that atmosphere, Eno luxuriated in the leisure, a goblet in his hand as he sat in a corner away from the center, watching the lively banquet like an audience member. It was the kind of relaxed, dreamlike magic world he'd longed for, simple and joyful, just like his first year. I never thought I'd one day attend a Slytherin banquet. Neville raised his goblet and looked around with a small, contented sigh. Neville, older now, was no longer the chubby boy who used to bury his head and cry. Standing over 1.6 meters tall, he carried himself with a touch of Gryffindor bravery. The point isn't that it's Slytherin, Eno said with a smile, lifting his cup. The point is that we're friends. The butterbeer in his goblet shimmered in the magical light like Felix Felicis. Neville, don't worry, he added. Magic is wondrous. Some things will get better. He had heard Neville's story about his parents long ago, and he had been thinking about how to help. The memory made him think of that first potions lesson before term began, facing Snape's unnerving questions. Even after so long, he could still remember his answer. Potions exist to prevent tragedies. Magic should be used that way too, so his mission was clear, to use magic to help as many people as possible. Neville heard the sincerity in his voice. Thanks, Eno, Neville said. I don't ask for much. As long as they're safe and I can see them at holidays, I'll be happy. Eno said nothing more, only reached out and patted Neville's shoulder. Until he had a lead, he didn't want to offer empty promises and raise false hope. The two of them left the subject there, tacitly understanding. Those two always seem to be made for being social, Neville observed, nodding toward a pair of lively figures weaving through the crowd. George and Fred, each with a canvas bag slung over his shoulder, threaded through the guests as if they'd simply resumed their old trade, selling flowers, trinkets, and delicate hairpins that the girls liked. Fred was grinning as he tried to sell a hairpin to Millicent Bulstrode. Millicent, a broad-shouldered Slytherin woman, looked shyly at Fred, treating the bauble like more than just an accessory, almost like a token of affection. Since the banquet began, everyone had found something to enjoy. Even Percy was chatting amiably with the formerly antagonistic Marcus. The sight was moving. House rivalries tended to fade with time, especially after graduation. Former prefects and captains could now sit together and raise a glass instead of trading barbs. Meanwhile, in London, the mood at number 4, Privet Drive, Little Winging, was entirely different. The room felt heavy. Petunia covered her mouth, eyes wide with panic, while Vernon lay motionless on the floor. Dudley, large as ever, had curled up in a corner like a frightened hamster, desperately seeking a little safety. In the center of the room, Harry stood holding a wand, his eyes a striking crimson as they swept the room like a hunting serpent. His expression was raw and hungry. When his gaze landed on Petunia, something in her terrified face and the tears on her cheeks seemed to touch him. Slowly, the crimson in his eyes faded and his expression cleared. His uncle on the floor, his aunt crying, Dudley trembling in the corner, Harry stared dumbly at the wand in his hand. He didn't know what had happened or how everything had come to this. Before dinner, Uncle Vernon had been his usual self, denouncing magic, an old routine. But for some reason this time, Harry had felt an overwhelming disgust that a muggle who didn't understand magic would dare slander Hogwarts and all wizards. The feeling had turned to humiliation, then to blinding anger, and then his memory stopped. Putting the scenes together, the conclusion was obvious. He had caused this. The wand clattered from his fingers to the floor. Petunia, who had been sobbing silently, leapt forward, scooped up the wand and held it tight as if it were the only thing keeping everything from falling apart. "Save Vernon, please," she begged. "He's in trouble. You must write to Dumbledore, to Severus, anyone. Ask them for help." Though she was a muggle, Petunia understood the wizarding world better than most. Lily used to tell her things during summer holidays. "I'll write right away." Harry nodded without speaking. "Uncle Vernon's just fainted." He turned and hurried for the second-floor storage room where Hedwig waited. He didn't need Petunia to tell him. He knew he was in deep trouble. It felt like the stories Ron used to tell in the dormitory, people cursed by dark wizards, personalities twisted beyond recognition. Since last school year, he'd been having strange dreams, too. Nights when he became a winding, slithering snake moving alone through a dense forest. It had been odd and unsettling, but he'd planned to keep it to himself, until now. Seeing Vernon on the floor made him grateful that he only knew basic spells, otherwise the consequences might have been far worse. His pace quickened as he went up the stairs. Hedwig, in her cage, seemed to sense his urgency and let out a sharp, rare hoot. 10 minutes later, a pure white owl cut through the London night. Unlike the leisurely flight of most nocturnal birds, Hedwig's wings beat furiously as she raced through the sky, anxious and determined, flying as fast as she could. The Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes at the Ministry of Magic was on the move again. This time, it wasn't a major catastrophe, just a trace alarm that showed a young witch or wizard had broken the rules by doing magic outside school. Normally, that would have meant a warning letter, but when the department confirmed the location and the person involved, they grew concerned and sent officers on duty to investigate. 4 Privet Drive. Faced with the ministry officials' questioning, Harry offered no defense. He admitted his mistake outright. That honesty left the 2 officials awkward. They had not expected the boy who lived to be so blunt. If he had offered any excuse, they could have smoothed it over. It had not been a serious incident, after all. Only a muggle had fainted. They had checked. The muggle was not seriously hurt. "Mr. Potter, are you sure you deliberately attacked Mr. Hine, Vernon Dursley, and it wasn't an accident or a case of uncontrolled magic?" one of them asked, the question almost explicit. Harry nodded in silence. "Yes, I deliberately attacked Uncle Vernon." He understood the hint in their question, but a vague unease made him unwilling to stay. Compared to a worst-case outcome, being taken to the ministry seemed the safer choice. The official sighed. "All right, Mr. Potter, given last year's incident, inflating a muggle, this is a second offense. I regret to inform you that you'll need to come with us to the ministry." After the ministry personnel took Harry away, Petunia, having checked that her husband was okay, went out to the garage, started the car and sped off down the lane. High above the countryside, Hedwig flew at full speed until, before dawn, the familiar towers of Hogwarts rose beneath her. She reached the headmaster's office and tapped sharply at the window. Dumbledore, dozing in the office he chose to keep as his home, even through vacations, woke at the sound. Hedwig flew in, hooting urgently as if bringing a summons. Dumbledore recognized the owl at once and opened the envelope. Harry's handwriting was messy and panicked. The letter confirmed the turmoil he felt. Dumbledore set it down with a troubled look. The discovery of that diary had already confirmed Tom Riddle's secret of immortality. The appearance of the Slytherin locket had made it clear there were multiple Horcruxes. Now this letter suggested something more worrying, that Harry seemed to have some sort of link to Tom. 2 people who should be unconnected had somehow become connected. Dumbledore opened the cabinet and took out a pensieve, an heirloom of Hogwarts. He drew his wand from his sleeve, and a silvery thread of memory rose from his temple and flowed softly into the Pensieve. Then he immersed himself in the memories. Meanwhile, as Dumbledore delved into the Pensieve, a nearly new Aston Martin rolled slowly into the shabby lane of Spinner's End. This night had kept many people awake, for some fate felt brutally fair. Where some could not sleep, others slept on undisturbed. Dawn crept into Hogsmeade. In a small cottage, Eno sat bolt upright and stretched, waking after a banquet that had kept him up until midnight. He washed quickly and picked up the Daily Prophet from the table, expecting the Malfoy Manor event to dominate the front page. Instead, the bold headline screamed something else. The boy who lived again grabs attention, publicly attacks Muggle Guardian with wand. Eno narrowed his eyes. He knew Harry, from stories or from encounters at Hogwarts, and he believed Harry was basically a law-abiding student so long as he wasn't provoked. Harry brazenly attacking his guardian with magic simply didn't add up. "They'll do anything for sales," he muttered. "They'll use any headline." Still, he read on. Sensationalism often revealed more than it pretended to. The article quoted Harry as admitting his mistake and saying he had been out of control. To most readers, that would sound like a clumsy excuse from a boy caught doing wrong. But Eno's knowledge of the deeper story made him frown. In the original timeline, Harry only learned occlumency in his 5th year, in 1996. The diary Horcrux had been destroyed in his 2nd year, and the earliest of the other Horcruxes to fall, the Gaunt Ring, was also destroyed in 1996. Perhaps as the number of Horcruxes decreases, Tom's control over Harry strengthens, Eno speculated. It fit the timeline. With fewer pieces of soul anchoring Voldemort, the fragment attached to Harry could be exerting more influence. The article's mention of Harry being out of control supported the idea. In the original story, the second Horcrux's destruction had only given Harry a headache. Now, with 3 Horcruxes destroyed, the diary, the Slytherin locket, and Ravenclaw's diadem, the increased influence made some sense. He felt a little relieved by that line of thought. He had planned to spend time destroying the remaining Horcruxes before the Quidditch World Cup. If he had tried to destroy the diadem and the ring all at once, the remnant of Voldemort's soul inside Harry might have been able to act. One unresolved issue remained. Why, in the end, could Harry still face Voldemort safely after all the Horcruxes were gone? That question nagged at him. Sitting quietly in his second-floor bedroom, Eno began to run the story through his memory as clearly as he could. The main events of each school year flickered through his mind like slides. First year, the diary, the Chamber of Secrets, Goblet of Fire, the resurrection ritual. Bone of father, flesh of servant, blood of enemy. The rule of Voldemort's rebirth flashed through his thoughts. He pieced together the root of the problem. Voldemort's use of Harry's blood to resurrect himself seemed to bypass Lily's protective magic, but in doing so, he may have lost direct control over Harry. It had been a trade. On the surface, a clever move that preserved Voldemort's power, but by taking Harry's blood, he also anchored a part of himself to Harry in a way that made absolute domination impossible. If Voldemort had realized that Harry contained a hidden Horcrux beforehand, he most likely would not have used Harry's blood at all. 277. Harry in the Igloo. The first floor of the British Ministry of Magic housed the offices of all the senior officials, including the minister. Persian cashmere carpets ran the length of the corridor, as if such finery might muffle the tread of visitors and spare the occupants of the offices any disturbance. At the far end, behind a heavy door, was the minister's office. Cornelius Fudge had not been surprised to see Albus Dumbledore arrive. What had surprised him was the reason. 2 officious members of the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes had dragged Harry Potter into the ministry the day before. "It may not be a major incident," Cornelius protested, "but the public needs an explanation." He put on a show of reluctance and looked toward Dumbledore. The previous year's Dementor affair, its newspaper rows, and the invisible political tug-of-war within the ministry had made Cornelius only too aware of the old headmaster's influence. He was waiting for Dumbledore to smooth things over so he could publish a calming statement and, if he could, rob Dumbledore of some prestige. "This is not the same as before," Dumbledore said quietly. "It's not only different, it concerns Lord Voldemort." Enough! Don't say his name. Cornelius barked, suddenly flustered. He's dead. He's been dead for over 10 years. Dumbledore said no more. He had long learned that some men, when frightened, shrank like an akami curled up inside a teacup. Cornelius waved him off. Take the boy away, he said irritably. Tell him to learn to behave, or to learn to be clever. Don't embarrass us like this again. Dumbledore only shook his head slightly. Some things do not vanish by pretending not to see them, he said before he left. Later that day, Dumbledore found what he had been looking for: Hogsmeade. Eno opened the door to his sitting room and blinked at the two figures on the threshold, one old, one young. Professor Dumbledore, Harry. Long time no see, he said, surprised. I'm sorry to intrude, Eno, Dumbledore said. I couldn't think of a better place in so short a time. Don't apologize. Your visit is an honor. Besides, Harry and I are friends. Eno stepped aside and invited them in. Dumbledore sat and came straight to the point. You must have read today's paper. What's printed there is true. Do you remember the Mirror of Erised? Of course, Eno replied. I finished with it a while ago. I was planning to return it when term started. Dumbledore shook his head. It isn't about the mirror, he said. It's about what was frozen that night. He explained carefully. The moment he had seen Harry at the ministry, he suspected the cause. After revisiting the memories in a Pensieve, Dumbledore had been forced to accept an awful possibility. The events at Godric's Hollow had satisfied the conditions for a Horcrux, and in some manner, Harry had been made into a living Horcrux by Lord Voldemort. Fortunately, Dumbledore added, Voldemort had not realized this. Eno's face turned thoughtful. Frost can indeed cloak thoughts, he said slowly, but I can't say how effective it will be against others' magic. He glanced at Harry with an apologetic, helpless expression. If possible, Harry should learn occlumency. In theory, it will help prevent intrusions, and it takes time. Dumbledore's eyes lit, then closed again in worry. You're right, occlumency is the best defense, but I don't know how much time we have. In the meantime, we need to protect him. Then let's try something, Eno said, looking at Harry. The boy gave a small, embarrassed smile. If it doesn't work, we'll find something else. Eno did not immediately attempt legilimency. He knew how invasive it was. Instead, he pointed toward the coffee table, and with a quick, practiced motion, a small house of frost condensed around Harry. It formed into a neat cube about 2 meters across. The frost was about an inch thick, translucent and pale blue. It did not obscure the view in or out, but it radiated a light chill. Eno stepped back and watched. Dumbledore frowned, equally reluctant to intrude. He raised his wand, Elder Wand in hand, and aimed it at the ice shelter. For a tense moment, nothing happened. Then Dumbledore relaxed, and a smile creased his face as if a burden had been lifted. It worked, he said quietly. Harry will need help, but this seems to prevent outside mental prying. I will arrange an excellent professor to teach him occlumency. It's nothing, Eno said with casual courtesy. For him, it had been a small favor, and an unexpected discovery of the defensive properties of his ice magic. The knock at the door came then. Eno started, surprised by all the day's visitors, and rose to open it. A streak of black filled the doorway. Good morning, Professor Snape, Eno said, laughing lightly. Severus Snape nodded once and entered without fanfare. Eno did not close in on the newcomers. Instead, he opened a can of chilled butterbeer and stood to the side, clearly intending to enjoy the scene. 3 generations gathered, the old, the middle-aged, and the young, each with his own stakes and secrets. With Voldemort no longer a threat to him, Eno could afford to watch with a relaxed air. On the side table, a small pamphlet lay open, a domestic oddity that had been left there earlier. Its heading read, Shao Di's Share Today, Thibaut, and it listed the usual ministry classification details. British Ministry of Magic. Classification level, XXXX. Origin and distribution, found in the Congo and Zaire. Appearance, pale gray warthog-like creatures. Abilities and uses. Tibos can turn invisible, making them hard to detect and dangerous to handle. Their hides can be fashioned into shields and protective clothing and are highly prized by witches and wizards. Hogsmeade. The little hut looked as cold and still as a glass box. Severus Snape stepped inside with his usual expression of bored indifference. No one there could have guessed the turmoil roiling beneath it. Before dawn that morning, he had seen a face from his childhood, a face he had always associated with jealousy and bitterness. After Petunia's description, he knew it could not be so simple. Harry was protected by sacrificial magic. In theory, no curse should easily touch him. But those scarlet eyes, that wild look. In the first instant, Snape's mind had caught at a memory. He had written Dumbledore a letter and come straight here. The hut was a blue, icy room, the light refracting off the walls like glass. Harry sat alone, looking small and helpless, emerald eyes very clear. The sight of him stirred something like a flame in Snape, hot, incomprehensible anger. He scanned the room. Harry could not be the cause. A boy at a corner table sipped butterbeer with an expression that broadcast spectator too loudly to be accidental. He was a student, too. Snape's gaze settled instead on the old man across from him. "I thought he would be safe," Snape burst out, a rare torrent of words spilling from him. "I believed those ridiculous claims. I believed Hogwarts was the safest place. I believed a certain someone was the greatest white wizard." His voice trailed off into bitterness. Harry, who had heard the story of his parents on the train the previous year, was surprised by Snape's vehemence. He'd grown up learning to read hostility and kindness in faces. Snape's reaction felt excessive to him. The boy with the butterbeer, Eno, watched with a thinly veiled interest but gave no sign of shock. He had been the one who told Harry the older generation's grievances. He had never painted Snape as a hero. When Snape noticed someone listening, he murmured, "Muffliato," the wandless spell spreading a soft bubble of private noise, and then he deliberately covered Harry's ears, just in case. As if on cue, Snape turned his head again. Another student was pretending not to listen. Eno set down his drink and exaggeratedly cupped his ears, an innocent, mocking gesture that said, "You can talk. I'm not eavesdropping." The gesture was transparent, but when Snape looked at him, something odd pricked at him, an unfamiliar pressure simply from Eno's presence. Snape let the gesture stand. The pretense gave them all an out. The whole exchange took only seconds. Dumbledore did not watch that teacher-student ballet. He had to form his words into something precise and true. He understood Severus. He had long understood him. He also knew what the other man's reaction could be. "Severus," he said quietly, "there are things you should know. This is the last thing I wanted to have to tell you, but it has happened." Hearing that tone, the surge of anger slid away from Snape's face, and a hard solemnity took its place. Dumbledore began, careful and weighed. From Tom's childhood at Wool's orphanage, the tragedy of Myrtle, the odd chain of events that had put young Tom Riddle in position after position. Small incidents that had been visible to him, and yet somehow still slipped through. He spoke of the defense against the dark arts position, of choices that seemed inevitable in hindsight. For the four in the hut, only Harry was shut out of the sound. Muffliato and Snape's hand made sure of that. Yet his vision was not blocked. Through the clear ice wall, he could watch each face and see everything that couldn't be said aloud. From Dumbledore's guilt, from Eno's thoughtfulness, from Snape's stone calm, the scene struck Harry with a strange, sinking certainty. He felt younger than he wanted to feel, as if time were being taken from him. He had loved Hogwarts. The cramped, lonely years at the Dursleys had been swallowed whole by the wonder of every day here. He wanted more time to play Quidditch, to tease McGonagall about homework, to say goodbye properly to friends. He wanted to graduate before anything happened. The ache behind his eyes stung, and for a moment it felt as if dust had flown into them. Then, in front of him on the icy wall, a line of words scrawled itself for a moment and warmed him. "Don't overthink it. Just two professors having a private conversation, afraid of being overheard by students." It was a quick, jokey reassurance, and it felt like a small hand on his shoulder. Someone still cared. Dumbledore stopped pacing his history and spoke the thing that had made all the rest of his guilt and careful phrasing necessary. Harry had become, unexpectedly, horribly, a living Horcrux for Lord Voldemort. The words were simple. The meaning was enormous. Snape closed his eyes, the anger draining from him. When he opened them, his face was the still surface of cold water. "Is there no way at all?" he asked, voice flat enough to lower the room's temperature. Dumbledore's reply was weary but honest. He had thought of only one possibility. Horcruxes could not be reversed. Once the bond was made, Harry and Tom were tied together. There was only a single way to break that link, and it had to be acted by Tom himself. Snape listened to that, and the hardness in him did not return. There was nothing left of the rage that had come into the hut. As Dumbledore spoke, Eno's mind turned over the details he'd been given. The Goblet of Fire, the resurrected Dark Lord, all of it had occurred, so far as he could tell, under Dumbledore's watching eye. The real variable in that tangled tale had been Cedric Diggory. No one expected the Hufflepuff boy to stand with such Gryffindor courage. Cedric's bravery and Pettigrew's sudden, fatal spell had altered the sequence of events irrevocably. Even at the end, Dumbledore had acted in the only way he felt he could, choosing a terrible act in the tower of the castle he loved. Whether that had been atonement or something else, none could say. What was clear was his devotion to Hogwarts and to every young witch and wizard who grew up within its walls. In the cold quiet that followed, everyone in the little hut felt the same terrible weight of what had been revealed and the same helplessness at the only possible remedy. 279. The inertia of fate, sacrifice, and atonement. Fate seemed to be snapping back onto its original course. Lord Voldemort would probably be resurrected. But unlike the original timeline, where everything nearly collapsed, the present situation resembled Quirrell in his first year, allowing him to act freely while everyone else tacitly cooperated. As Dumbledore finalized his plans, a heavy silence settled over the cottage. Snape was not foolish enough to ask whether the method would work. That question was irrelevant. Even the so-called greatest wizard's answers would be unreliable. He trusted his own judgment more than anyone else's. Beneath his composed face, his mind was busily calculating the plan's feasibility. In the ice house, Harry watched them fall silent, curious why the conversation had stopped. His ears were blocked by charm work, so he turned his head to avoid overhearing. On the other side, Eno ignored Harry's pleading gaze. He was waiting for the right moment to voice a conjecture and propose an alternative. At the sight of Snape's resigned expression, Eno spoke up slowly. "Professor," he said, "there's another way." Dumbledore and Snape turned, surprised. Why was Harry safe for the last 11 years, even in those early pre-Hogwarts years, but now something has changed precisely at this time? Eno continued. What if it's a matter of Horcrux count and Voldemort's control? Couldn't we simply maintain the current state, keep the number of Horcruxes stable, and get Harry to master occlumency as thoroughly as possible? That would be conservative, but safer than setting a stage for a private duel between Voldemort and Harry. He watched their faces for a reaction. Dumbledore seemed tempted. Snape's brow tightened. "You don't understand how evil he is," Snape objected. "If your conjecture is wrong, Harry won't have a chance." That was Snape's explicit reason. Quietly, he also harbored a deeper hope. After Voldemort returned, Dumbledore and the Dark Lord would be forced to confront each other, and their rivalry might last decades. That delay would be the safest course. In those decades, Snape believed he could brew a potion to suppress Horcruxes. He had confidence that even problems like the Wolfsbane potion, which had long bedeviled wizards, could be mastered. His occlumency kept these thoughts hidden. Even Dumbledore, so close, noticed nothing. Eno, for his part, assumed Snape's objections sprang from concern for Harry. Dumbledore saw Snape's disapproval and let the alternative rest. "Whatever else we decide, occlumency is essential and urgent," he said. "Severus, you and Eno must cooperate to teach Harry occlumency as quickly as possible." Satisfied, Dumbledore lifted the ear-blocking charm. Harry, sitting quietly in the ice house, didn't ask questions. He remained calm. From where he stood, Eno looked at the composed boy, then at Dumbledore and Snape. A sudden thought struck him. A boy's growth could happen in an instant. Harry already bore a hint of the steady demeanor he would need in the final confrontation. Their agreement was barely settled when a crude, violent knocking split the quiet. Bang! 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 The rudeness of the knock pricked at Eno. Since he'd bought the cottage, nobody had ever knocked like that. These people intended to force their way in. The annoyance made the shadow beneath his feet twitch. Faint smoke slid along the floor toward the door. "Open the door! I know you're in there!" "What happened to Harry?" a voice shouted. It was Sirius, pounding on the door. He had sat at home until the Ministry's message made no sense. Harry had apparently used magic publicly to attack his uncle and had been taken by Ministry personnel. If the messenger hadn't been related to the Blacks, Sirius might have thought it a prank. By the time he reached the Ministry, he was too late. Dumbledore had already removed Harry. The reach of a pure-blood network showed itself now. Sirius had used the trace through the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes to locate Harry in Hogsmeade. As he kept knocking, an odd chill crawled up his neck. It was a sunny day, and yet he felt like he was standing in Azkaban. Dumbledore smiled, rose, and took a step toward the door. The faint smoke along the floor dispersed as he moved. Eno turned and went upstairs. They'd reached an agreement, and there was no need to linger to watch a father and son reunion. Snape, sneering, rose as well and strode toward the fireplace, moving with the look of a man who wanted to avoid a mad dog. In the ice house, the small smile that had been on Harry's face vanished as the two men left. He turned his head, sighed softly, and then the smile returned. Upstairs, Eno lay half-reclining on the bed, irritated by the exaggerated commotion downstairs. "Dogs," he muttered, then his figure disappeared from the room. Shelter Valley was the picture of tranquility. Sprawling across more than 100 acres, the valley bloomed with every kind of magical plant. Gray Mimbulus Mimbletonia, lively jumping spider plants, pink umbrella flowers, sparkling bubble pods, an abundant herb garden born of patient labor. Trolls and goblins had carried out his orders. Before he first crossed into Middle-earth, he had scattered seeds and given planting instructions to those industrious workers. 10 years had passed. Because time flowed differently here, the cost of growing mature magical herbs was minimal. Seeds bought before the summer holidays had, after one trip to Middle-earth, become 10-year-old specimens in this sheltered valley. 280, Valley Herb Plantation with exotic flowers. In the valley, Eno surveyed the landscape with satisfaction. Then he noticed something odd in the distance. Outside the field of magical plants, in a small clearing, many unnatural, almost grotesque plants had sprung up. He walked quickly across the valley. As he closed the distance, it felt as if he had stepped into a storybook garden. The plants were no longer simply green. They seemed born from a child's boundless imagination. Shimmering, multicolored leaves greeted him, at first glance beautiful, but on closer inspection, they looked as though they had been cut from glossy candy wrappers, and approaching them released a sweet, confectionery scent. Nestled among those leaves were flower buds like flawless crystal balls, transparent, perfect, and gleaming. One look filled him with a buoyant delight. These crystal flowers truly resembled the enchanted blossoms of fairy tales, mysterious and dreamlike. Perhaps sensing his gaze, the flowers gently swayed their tender stems as if greeting him. He stepped lightly toward the center. There stood, taller than the rest, a 5-foot-tall tulip of startling, vivid red. Eno had noticed this marker from afar. When he reached it, a warm, comfortable feeling rose up within him. The tulip's stem was nearly 1.5 meters high and as graceful as a dancer's silhouette. Its leaves were like silk, smooth and finely textured. His eyes climbed to the proud bud at its apex, ruby bright, passionate, full of life. The unbloomed bud possessed an unrefined, raw beauty. Creation and passion, pure as fire, he thought. The red tulip gave him a different sensation altogether. So different that, standing beside it, he felt compelled to hum softly. Half an hour later, an ice troll stood a short distance away, holding a thick linen cloth. A timid goblin crouched behind it. Eno brushed them aside with a wave. Tom and Jerry, that comical duo. The moment he saw the linen cloth, he knew where the dream garden had come from. It was the very cloth he had used in the kingdom of Rowan to wrap the stones the children had collected. Out of respect for the children's efforts, he had kept it instead of discarding it, leaving it in a simple hut. When he left, not wanting to disappoint them, he tucked it into his suitcase under an undetectable extension charm and took it along. He had never expected such an unintentional keepsake to produce such unexpected results. The candy wrapper leaves and the crystal flowers now made sense, products of children's imagination, but the exquisitely red tulip puzzled him. Something about it felt wrong. It shouldn't have come from the children. The feeling had no concrete basis, only a persistent dreamlike certainty that lingered in his mind. "I can't figure it out," he murmured, rubbing his brow. He raised his wand. The windows of the 2-story White House in the valley seemed to open of their own accord. From inside, a magnificent crown inlaid with sapphires flew out, the Ravenclaw diadem. It settled gently on his head, and a cool clarity washed over him. Under that coolness, the useless, drifting thoughts in his mind felt like dandelion seeds in a breeze, blown clean away. Images snapped into precise connection. Middle-earth, Rohan, the capital, the little house, scenes from the past flashed by, and then one image froze. In it, an elderly man in a white robe stood in the small house, Gandalf's sudden visit on the morning before he had set up his stall. The vision shifted. Unlike the valley's calm, Hogsmeade was agitated. Sirius was pacing. Half a term had made everything unfamiliar to him. Things had been fine last Christmas, but now Harry's summer felt like imprisonment, confined to a small, icy cage. What outraged Sirius most was that for the foreseeable future, Harry would have to endure that greasy-haired professor. Professor Dumbledore, can this really not be changed? That occlumency. I'll pay to find Harry the best teacher, no matter the cost. Sirius pleaded. That's enough, Sirius. Dumbledore interrupted. He had heard this more than once. I asked Severus because, in all of Europe, I know no one more skilled in occlumency. But, Sirius opened his mouth, then shut it. Dumbledore had made his point. There was nothing left to argue. It's all right, Sirius. Harry interceded at the right moment. Professor Snape isn't so bad. Besides, Eno will come sometimes to accompany me. Sirius exhaled. If that greasy-haired professor dares to bully you, tell me when you get back, and I'll see to him myself. Harry only nodded. As someone who had felt the public humiliation of the Bat-Bogey Hex and Lockhart's dueling disasters, he understood how demeaning such exposure could be. He knew what it would feel like to be left suspended and laughed at, and in imagining Snape subjected to that, he felt a surprising deep sympathy. Had he been the one humiliated like that in front of the girl he liked, wearing only robes, he would have wanted revenge. He felt genuine guilt for the thought. Time flowed on. Before noon, Eno left the valley and returned to his bedroom on the second floor. The house was quiet now. The others had apparently gone out, which relieved him. After wearing the Ravenclaw diadem and considering the visions, the meaning of the red tulip at last became clear. The tulip had been nurtured by small acts, a few good deeds, a soft song, a storybook, exchanged for one of the 3 elven rings, Narya, the Ring of Fire. The generosity behind such an exchange took him by surprise. He stood for a long moment, absorbing how a piece of cloth and a handful of kindnesses had grown into something so wondrous. Then he set the diadem aside, and the valley's peculiar garden shimmered behind his eyelids as he prepared to move on.